So thank you. I know everyone's been here a long time, and I'm going to do my best to make this very informative and hopefully educational in some way, and you'll have some tools to help you. So I want to begin by just saying a little bit. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a gay woman. I am a gay mother. I have a son who's 23 years old, and the apple of my eye, very much so. And my partner and I have been together for a very long time, and we've seen so much over the years. And part of what I want to talk about, honestly, what has been talked about today, especially in these large sessions and even in the breakout rooms, has all centered around not just the theme of allyship, but also a lot of things that I'm going to talk about. So I was sitting here listening going, how am I going to make this more interesting? No, different from what we've heard. But I think it will come together. So what I have been curious about for quite a while is this generation of young adults, queer young adults. I've published about it. I've been sort of observing their process. I am fascinated by them. I think they are amazing. And what I see in them is what I wish I had been able to have and experience. And yet, as we heard today, a lot of stories of pain and oppression persist. And Naomi, more mothers like you need to be in this world. And I just want to say thank you for who you are and the kind of affirming home you create. So I want to give you another. So I have a new publication coming out soon, and the team of people that you see listed up there, Dan Alonzo, Jose Paez, Dana Stone, and Claire Sobel, who's here today, we have worked on a piece that centers around what we witnessed. One of my first areas was looking at, actually wrote an article with Dan, and it was called, Is Coming Out Still Necessary? Because these young people seem to come out, again, the stories we heard today, right, are clearly not reflecting always what I'm about to say, but a lot of younger people come out with a level of pride that is admirable and a level of congruence and identity, and yet there is tremendous struggle still. So today I want to talk about some of the things that really got crystallized and magnified during COVID and with the co-occurring crisis of the socio-political, what is called now anti-LGBTQIA extremism. And that is ever, continuing. So the objectives are really to talk a little bit about socialization, which is the one thing I think that needs to change. We've heard everybody tell their stories about how family, school, religion affected and contributed to oppression. And that's all a part of the socialization process. So I'm going to talk about that. I want to talk about emerging adulthood because I think it offers a unique window of opportunity for change that is sometimes more difficult and even dangerous in younger years until socialization changes. So I'll talk about that. And then discuss the importance of an affirming community. So just talking a little bit about, every time I turn around, what was going on. Yes, I had to put this picture. Is there a pointer here? Right here. Sorry, but he had to appear somewhere. We had a generation that dealt with multiple intersecting stressors that were unprecedented in many ways. You've heard that word so many times. So not only their generational reality of who they are and the world they grew up into, in spite of Kern County and in spite of different parts of this country and globally, this was a generation that really had never seen and has yet to see, hadn't seen what is happening now. And even I, who have been around longer, have not seen some of what I'm seeing now at the level I'm seeing it. It's pretty amazing. So if we look at Gen Z, this is the group born between the years, I have it there, 1997 and 2012. So the research actually calls this group trending queer. They are the largest queer cohort in American history. Let's give us a round of applause for queer youth that are finding their identity so early and really just having a voice. We've heard those voices today, and it's inspiring and it's amazing. They've also had the privilege, quite honestly, and I say this, of having greater representation in the media, in other aspects, in organizations and advocacy that didn't exist, generations ago, let's say, okay? That said, we still have so much oppression. And so we want to really look at why. Why are these stories of oppression even needing to be told? Well, because all of this advancement led to backlash, which we're going to talk about, and I think that's kind of the place we're at. So the next thing that happened with this population, this cohort of young emerging adults, is this cognitive dissonance and loss of hope that became a pretty significant crisis. And in the research, what we saw is that the dramatic drop in mental health status and well-being was so profound, it was terrifying. Suicidality was on the rise, and so many of you don't know me, but one thing I love is creating a slide. So I just want to appreciate that I have found a way to transparently impose the COVID virus over these realities. So, thank you, yes. I don't know, I always say. So, this is a generation that grew up, came, during the Obama era when gay marriage came, so they've seen a lot. That's why they had more gay, straight alliances in schools. They had more access. Actually, in 2018, I believe, there was a study done that said all of this work that's being done in schools is helping, right? Because earlier on, it is giving young people, middle school, and high school, a safe space, right? In those schools that were doing that. And someone had mentioned this in one of the other talks. This is a generation that comes out earlier than anyone else, any other generation before. But they've also seen, and if you look at these numbers up here, in 2018, there were 42 anti-LGBTQ laws, right? Or legislation. Now we have currently 510, and that was the most recent number that we have that are being, at least introduced. Some have advanced, a lot of them have been shot down, and some have passed. And so what this has created is a new discourse out there. And suddenly, so you talked about your kid coming home from college. That was an issue, right? That was an issue for young people across this country. It was an issue globally. But I want to talk about emerging adulthood as a unique time. That's why this talk is called A Window of Opportunity. It is a unique time that is intended for exploration, intended for going out and trying things that you may not have done in the context of your family. And it's not that family is bad. There's a lot of affirming homes. You have an affirming home, which you were just talking about. But then new things are discovered out in the world when you have the freedom to do so. And actually there's other research that points to what we call the coming out process or identity formation, needing people to separate just a little bit from their families, which is normal and expected at this stage of life. Also, there's greater independence at this stage of life. So when there's greater independence, there's a little less vulnerability in terms of some of the factors that can present for a 15-year-old that gets thrown out of their home. A 15-year-old may not be able to get a job, for example. So, and again, appreciation to all of the organizations that provide support and stability for youth. For queer emerging adults, this is a time for experimenting with things that were perhaps prohibited even in affirming homes, such as the full expression of identity, the experimentation with sex in ways that could not have been, like, I've heard stories as a clinician and even from some of my students, like, you can, I don't care that you like women, or that you want to be in a same-sex marriage, but you can't bring that here, right? And maybe they're 18 years old and their 19-year-old straight sibling is getting to have their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever in the house. So it becomes like a double standard. And implicit little messages, someone talked about misguided messages that do get internalized. And again, that need to separate, and why that is so important is because when you separate, that was true for me too. I had to move like away. And then when you're not like under the pressures of socialization, or what was the term you used? Like the cult-like, right? It is like the norms of society, when you can just distance a little and get into affirming communities that are like, you're like me. Oh my gosh, I didn't see this or know about this at the level, and what do we do and how? And this feels good. That is a liberating experience. And queer people in the room, you probably know what I'm talking about. It is so wonderful. And it's not because we don't have maybe an affirming home. Maybe in some cases that obviously can be the case. But even in an affirming home, there's a level of respect for the norms that still kind of have us fall in line. I still fall in line when I go home to a family dinner sometimes, just because it's easier, right? So that's just what we know. So how does that look? What are some of the ways in which a queer young person is gonna like step out, go out, and find themselves more? And it's about practicing with things like disclosure. Again, this generation has tended to do this younger, but disclosure, sharing more. Interestingly enough, a lot of the newer models of coming out, a term we used to use so much, and by the way, the answer to the question of is coming out still relevant? Yes, it is. And we use that term, it's basically just sharing who you are authentically. But it used to be considered like this massive thing, and if you didn't do that, you really were not going to be okay. And most of the newer models, for those of you who are allies or clinicians, push against that idea. Because it's not A, sometimes safe, B, It's not necessary. And you can find ways to affirm your identity that don't require putting you at risk and or losing things that are meaningful to you until you have greater solidarity and understanding and security with your identity. And this is why sometimes having just a little bit of distance from, and I'm going to keep saying the system of the family or religion, I've heard that mentioned a couple times today, et cetera, so is very important. So it can be disclosure, it can be, again, I talked about sex, and remembering that it's not a single story. We have multiple intersecting identities. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about that and the importance, obviously, of intersectionality. And one of the things we have to remember is that sometimes people are navigating racial, gender, sexual identity, ability, and a variety of different dimensions of who they are. And all of that has to be factored in. And some of the models are called Coming Into the Life by Mignon Moore. Staying In, meaning staying in the closet, so to speak, by Sharon Brooks. These are two Black scholars who have studied how Black women are navigating the intersection of race and their identity, their sexual identity. And sometimes the choice to align with racial identity is going to feel safer, and yet there's a need to learn about being Black and being gay or bisexual. And so this isn't an easy, straightforward, complex thing. So you touched on COVID in your talk. I do want to say Gen Z came of age during COVID. And so all those exploring and finding, that just like shut down, right? And in a situation where there isn't an affirming home, it led to a massive crisis. So we have young adults in general, whether they're gay, straight, whatever, just this group, not even just queer, but there was a mental health crisis with young people because they weren't launching and they weren't getting to go through some of the rites of passage that help them find identity in a variety of ways. So for queer adults, because that hasn't been going on their whole life, perhaps, because of socialization, they really became very oppressed and discouraged. There was greater dependence on the family. The Trevor Project has been, they've done some tremendous survey research, and we've all appreciated that. The Human Rights Campaign has done some tremendous research. Advocacy groups are doing wonderful things, but the latest study done, or survey research done by the Trevor Project, is that this population has now, has in their mind that they're gonna have a shorter life expectancy. And they don't see a purpose for themselves. And if we could just take that in for a moment, that is something I used to see when I worked with juveniles who had been incarcerated. Their mindset was basically, I'm not gonna live long. And now that's what LGBTQIA+ young people, according to this latest survey, are saying and reporting, because of all of these oppressive factors. So again, just real quick, returning to homes, isolation, but in particular, an interruption of that process, of that trajectory of identity formation that is unique to this stage of identity, that is sort of free of some of the socialization factors. So our group, our team, started to look at what is research saying? And I share some of the citations because I was fascinated by these citations. And my contact information will be at the end. Feel free to take a picture, email me, I can send you a list. But here are some of the things that we're seeing. It kind of breaks my heart. LGBTQ young adults responding to family rejection. These were all published between 2020 and 2023. And there's so much more but these are all studies looking at how the family socialization process is affecting young people. And so we developed a conceptual framework. Am I just talking too much? Everyone's like, it's, girl, hurry up. So a conceptual framework, okay? So this is the cycle of socialization. I need to look up here because my slides are now too tiny. So we have, right, we go up here. We have the cycle of socialization, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So what we knew is something about going back home and being stuck at home was a problem, even in affirming homes. Like, it became a problem. And a significant, but we know, again, emerging adulthood, like college, work environments, communities. And then COVID, they had to go back, and then all this socio-political mess began, significantly rising. And they were stuck, and they couldn't, and now they're just struggling, right? And so we saw an increase in distress. People have mentioned minority stress today. It is something that anybody talking about LGBTQIA need to really understand. Minority stress comes from outside the world, but it also comes from inside the person. Minority stress, unique to LGBTQ people, I think, is this, and everybody, all groups who've experienced marginalization, racial, gender, ability, disability, sexual and gender identity have a form of minority stress. So that idea of internalizing and all of that is really something to pay attention to. So discrimination, microaggressions, and hate and bullying, all part of that minority stress. The internal pieces that the queer person is like absorbing is a sudden sense of rejection sensitivity. If I am who I am, what is at stake? What am I going to lose? And, it might just be easier if I conceal my identity. I spent a great deal of time, a great deal of my developmental years concealing my identity because I wasn't sure. Also grew up in an Italian, Catholic, fairly traditional family. And then the internalization. What is unique to LGBTQ youth or people is that we're one minoritized group, okay, that this sort of minority stress begins in the family, or can begin in the family. Because if you don't know, if you're a parent and you don't know that your child is queer, jokes can be at the dinner table, things are said, people are mocking the news, and you're watching it all. And you're like, ooh, I don't want to be that person that they're mocking or they're saying mean things about, or, jokes in particular is one thing that I hear often. But the other thing, let's say now you're out. I experienced this in my family, even to this day, is that they don't really get what my life is about. I have one distant cousin who's gay, and me. And so I feel very othered in my family, unless I just sort of fall in line and go along and all of those things. So there is sometimes a minimizing of my lived experience. And even if I try to say, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe, I remember once we had just had our son, and my partner and I, we lived together in a house in a little suburb, you know. They were just like two women living together. And that was what the neighborhood perceived. And then once I got pregnant, they're like, oh, there's no man around. Well, I wonder. And then they have stories. And this isn't a talk about that, but I'll just tell you, other systems that are oppressive. Hospitals, thank you. The medical system. If I'm asked one more time, are you sure you don't need birth control? I'm sure. But why? Is that any of your business? You just listen to what I say, and no, I don't. Stop asking me that. Put it in the chart. Or after our son was born. Well, when I was pregnant, people started like distancing from us. And then we were literally harassed after our child was born by some neighborhood bullies who were kids, throwing things at us and saying terrible things to us where we had to actually intervene and do something. But when I tried to share all that with my family, they're like, oh, that's nothing. And how does that feel, right? It's dismissive. So you feel othered, you feel not seen. That's a form of not just a microaggression, but an experience where your family's not really getting like, you don't even understand how privileged you are, right? And so there's so much privilege in heterosexuality and cisgenderism. And so a lot of that, before you kind of get some clarity about your identity, is internalized, which we've talked about today and other. So concealment of identity, I just want to say this is really important, is a protective factor. And if you don't get that, and if you force a young person or anybody who's not ready, I've seen this in couples that I work with, queer couples, like one member's like, if you don't come out to your family, I'm done. And I'm like, what are you thinking? No, you cannot say that to your partner. Let them have their time. And they may never, and you just have to. So then how do we deal with that? There's a lot of complexity to all of this. So that's unique to every person. And so we started as a team looking at this concept, and I've been working with this since we began studying and gathering data since the pandemic began. Because it was very early on, I think in 2021, or even the end of 2020, when we started to see queer young people falling into the biggest mental health crisis collectively in large numbers that and it was concerning, right? Again, this was a group who had been so much more liberated seeming and felt very heightenedly oppressed at this point. And everybody's mentioned through the stories we've heard today in homes, in families, in religious institutions, and other systems that are supposed to be protective, like schools, not being protective. And so the cycle of socialization, if you don't know it, is Bobby Harrow's work that looks at how we're all socialized, which begins in the family with those norms and ideas, those beliefs that were talked about earlier. And then as you move out of the family into school and church and the synagogue and other systems, they get more and more solidified. And for children who are dependent and kind of, trusting, we follow along, right? We follow along, we get on board. not always, but more often people do. And then the dissonance begins, the incongruence begins. And something important in the cycle that I think is worth mentioning is this piece over here, which are called enforcements. And enforcements are the ways that family, religion, schools, society controls people, according to Harrow's theory and model, to stay in these socialized, heteronormative, cisgender models. And if I were to say anything that you take away from this today, this is what has to change. And not to toot my own horn, but where we find evidence of advancing socialization and queer socialization is in queer families, who intentionally have borrowed from racial socialization models where, you know, families who understand from a racial perspective that discrimination exists in the world. We need to tell gay kids and queer kids, there is discrimination, you know, and love is love, and you can be who you want to be, and all of these things, but those aren't the messages, right? So the cycle of socialization, that is what we are looking at, interrogating, deconstructing, and I have a little model for all of you to consider in beginning to have those conversations, being curious, as I've heard many times today. I also love that, was it Chris? Is Chris still here? Talked about heteronormativity being like humidity. That is beautiful metaphor for, yes, you feel it at the earliest moments in time when you're queer and you're in these systems. You're like, something doesn't feel right, but I'm going to go along because this is my grandmother, this is my mother, and I'm dependent on these people to care for me. And so we do. And then entered, I'm rounding the curve, folks, here, so the socio-political enforcements that are really concerning, to the point where the Human Rights Campaign in 2023, and it's still in effect right now, actually officially declared a national state of emergency for LGBTQ Americans, and has created a book, a guidebook about how to navigate the United States of America as a queer person if you're traveling from state to state. And we know that there's been other versions of the books like that to help minoritized groups stay safe. What? So what these laws are becoming, or this legislation is sort of sending a message to young people, you better get it, you better knock it off, right? We do not want this expansion of who you are. As a matter of fact, we're gonna shut it down. And we don't want tiny people in the schools to know about it, because we don't want any more of this. As if any of us ever had that in our schools. We didn't. So that whole argument is flawed, as we know. So another hobby of mine, which I love, and I encourage people to, yeah, this is the timeline piece. So some of my students, who I know are here, and I love them, have seen this, which is gonna come in a minute. It is a timeline. I collect both examples of liberation and hope, and I document tragedy that's occurred. And if you look closely at this timeline, one of the things you're gonna see is Let's just go with marriage equality, something that Gen Z actually witnessed and was a part of. That was why the White House was in rainbow, right? So, marriage equality passed. And a year later, the Pulse nightclub, right? And then people will say, well, don't argue with me about that. Oh, I hate when people argue with me about this. Okay, that's it, that's fine. But you're not queer, and you don't know how I experienced this. My experience of, so don't argue with me. No, I'm kidding. But like in the early 2000s, right, there were efforts to decriminalize homosexuality, and it was originally, someone held up the DSM long ago in the 70s, like a diagnosis, a mental disorder, which I think is still internalized by some generations. See. Well, there's a lot up there to look at. We don't have time. The next one, though, is going to be more up to date with where we are today. Just the next, yeah, that one. Okay, so this one really highlights all the things that have occurred in the last, during the pandemic, right? And then we see here over 20, and the number's higher now, trans individuals murdered. And I just want to highlight that, is that televised on the news ever? Do we ever see that? Do people know these things? Why not? That gets on my nerves. So beyond, these are the things. Why are we not hearing about this? Because it would interrupt that socialization of, right? These are people who stepped out of line of the socialization cycle. It is in an insidious way. So these are some of the laws that are currently on, and you can see book banning, which we know, sports bans, curriculum bans, forced outing, and efforts to redefine sex at the constitutional level. Concerning about that is it really taps into civil rights. And it's all bad. So these are the things, right, that you can do. We can externalize the problem. You are not the problem with narrative therapy. We name it. Socialization is the problem, right? And then so on and so on. There's a lot. And one of the techniques we're using is called storied identities as a 3-act play. And I did not come up with this, even though I have a theater background. That was long ago, many careers ago. But it's encouraging young people, emerging adults, to talk about and tell 3 stories. The first is, what was the influence of socialization on you? That's Act 1. What was the moment that you really woke up and were ready to step out of that? That's Act 2. Who was involved? And then number 3, when did you take a stand? Tell me a story when you felt a moment of liberation. And for us, you might be working with someone who's like, I don't know, I haven't. And our job is to listen to the counter story. Because the truth is, if that person is still sitting in front of you, that means that they exist. Their existence, they're still being here, is a sign of resilience, it's a sign of strength, and it's a sign of persistence. That identity is going to persist no matter how much you try to socialize me out of that. And that's a piece of a counter story. So now let's talk about how you managed to do that. And we were going to do an exercise, but unfortunately we don't have time. But do they get the slides or no? Okay. So you'll have the exercise with some questions that you can use as an ally, as a clinician. And finally, here's some things that help that we know, right? So, and theater and storytelling were actually named in one of the Trevor Project's surveys, which is great. And that's all. Thank you so much for your time.